Okay, hi everyone. Today we're gonna talk about economic miracles. What I intend to do is to describe you what happens when a society, the economy of a society, grows particularly rapidly in a short period of time. Okay, so let me share my screen with you and give you some details about this. Probably a good way to start this conversation is to explore your own perception about um, how you think economies have performed in recent history. So I want you to think which of the following economies grew more between 2013 and 2018. So think about a decade before the pandemic started, right? Ethiopia, Singapore, China, the United States, right? Um, Let me show you what people on Twitter say, right? So I did the survey on Twitter. Of course, like most of my followers are economists. And their perception was that Ethiopia, for most of them, was the economy that grew more in recent years, right? I think they're right, and you'll see this right away. So during this period, the U.S. grew 2.28% every year on average during this period. Then Singapore 3.35%, China 7.01%, but Ethiopia grew at a rate on average of 9.4%. That's quite a lot. Indeed, it is at the top of the fastest growing economies during this period. So this is the top 10 economies. Let me use the pen here. And and I want you to notice something that surprised a few people, right? So most of these countries are in sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia, in contrast to the perception that people have that those economies are growing more, or the wealthier economies, probably in Europe or in Northern America, right? The only European and, for the matter, Western country in this list is Ireland, who performed greatly during the previous decade. Um, I want you to notice something. I want you to pay attention to the size, the order of magnitudes here. So what we're saying is that Ethiopia grew at a compound rate of 9.4% every year. And probably that looks small, but it is that really. So I want you to give you an example of how these small differences in growth rates compound over time and generate huge differences in the living standards of people over decades. So I brought you this particular case. So in the 1960s, early 1960s, the GDP of Colombia was about 250 US dollars. That was higher than the one of Korea, which was 150, more or less, right? So that means that on average, um, a Colombian was 1.5 times wealthier than a Korean. That's a significant difference, right? That's quite a bit. Today, that difference not only flipped, but has widened quite a lot, right? So an average Korean earns 4.7 times more than an average Colombian, right? And let me show you this with a graph of the GDP per capita of the two countries, right? So you can see how the difference in the 60s was rather small, right? You can not even notice very well that Colombia was above Korea. And during the Korean miracle in the 80s and 90s, you see how Korea grew much faster. And you have this difference. It's not that Colombia was stagnated, it was growing, but not as fast as Korea. Let me show you this order of magnitude. So, Colombia grew actually very steadily at a rate more or less of 2%, right? So you can see how it was very stable. This is the average. The dotted line is the mean growth during this period, right? 2% basically. A very stable economy. Actually, that's a very interesting feature of the Colombian economic history, which is paradoxical compared with the rest of the continent and of Latin America, which is characterized for being particularly unstable. But that's another matter. For the moment, notice that Korea grew at a higher rate, but it doesn't look huge. So Korea grew on average at 6%. Um, that looks small, right? It's a difference of 4% every year. But that 4% accumulated over decades generated in half a century a difference of 500% in levels, right? That's huge. Indeed, about just 1% difference in a century would have led to similar changes, right? So again, what I'm trying to point out is that small differences in growth rate that are sustained over time lead to huge differences in the living conditions of society over long enough periods of time. Again, if you think about decades or centuries, and behind these are actually the real differences and the forces behind the differences in the current wealth of countries, right? I would like to show you how these differences look in real life, right? What these small, apparently, growth rates that compound rapidly during short periods of time generate in a society. And a good way of doing that is through brief like visualization of what happened with Shanghai, right? So this is Shanghai in the 1990s. This is the landscape of the skyline of Shanghai in the early 1990s, so 30 years ago. What happened was that during the Chinese miracle, in the last three decades, the society was transformed dramatically, right? And here you see how Shanghai looked already a decade ago, right? A completely different, not only landscape, but just imagine the change that this type of productive system, the one that generates this type of cities, represents for the people that live there, right? And we don't need to go that far, as you know. This video is part of a class of NYU Abu Dhabi on the wealth of nations, and the UAE is itself a miracle, right? So this is a particular area in Dubai called Dubai Marina, a residential area, very famous nowadays, that in the early 2000s was pretty much desertic, right? Nowadays, it's a huge compound of skyscrapers, right? And this happened in a couple of decades. This is part of the perception of what the Dubai miracle looks like. Abu Dhabi's experienced a similar process over a longer period of time and driven by somewhat different reasons, but similar as well. This is the corner of the Corniche. So this area is more or less this nowadays, but you can see how the economic boom that was originated mostly on the discovery of oil in the 70s eventually generated very prosperous societies, right? So this is what I want to talk to you today. What are the effects of high growths of rate during not exactly short periods of time, but during at least a decade, how this generates huge transformations in societies in terms of levels. So reach out if you have questions about this, and see you next time.